Oh, hi, I'm Jennifer Van Sickle. Welcome to my session on using critical service learning as a tool to seek social justice. So what I hope to accomplish in this session is to introduce you to issues around race and social justice. And we know that those issues have come up a lot recently, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think there's no better time than now to talk about how we can talk about systemic racism and social justice issues in our sport management classrooms. What I hope to do is introduce you to a new way to do that via critical service learning. So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce you to the concept of critical service learning as an avenue to teach social justice, but also to let you know how I've done that in my classroom. So first of all, I think it's really important for me to say that I am not an expert in the area of race or social justice or systemic racism. As a matter of fact, when I first heard about the concept of critical service learning, I was pretty intimidated. And here's why. Here's the tenets of critical service learning, and I'm going to read those to you. According to Tania Mitchell, they are to interrogate systems and structures of inequality and question the distribution of power. Now, I got to tell you that I don't know how to do that. Not at all. But I knew that I wanted to. And I knew that this could be one avenue where I could teach students about social justice issues and go beyond case studies or just regular discussions, but to really help them apply this in their own life and to see how it might work in a sports setting. So I felt like that critical service learning provided me with that opportunity. So first of all, let's talk about what service learning is, and then we'll talk about what critical service learning is. So as you can see from the graphic that I put together here, service learning is the intersection of community, course content, and practical experience. Now, what I mean by that is what you're trying to do in your course is to meet a need of a community via some type of experiential learning concept. And hopefully that meets up with whatever you're talking about in your class. So it's a win-win situation. Your students get to apply something that's happening in your course and you're meeting a community need. Now, here's what makes service learning different from experiential learning. Service learning requires reflection. So at some point during the process, in some service learning projects, it's throughout the process, students need to reflect upon what they're learning. And in this instance, also perhaps how what they've done has met that community need. So reflection can happen at the beginning of the service learning project. It can happen throughout the service learning project, or it can happen at the end of the service learning project. So what is critical service learning then? So much like service learning, critical service learning is the intersection of community, course content, practical experience, but it includes that social justice component that's not in a regular service learning project. All right. Critical service learning is the opportunity, as I said before, for you to introduce concepts of social justice so that you have the discussions about social justice or the systemic racism or LGBTQ issues or whatever you're trying to bring into this course. You have those discussions before you go out and do the service learning project. And that's very, very important because sometimes what can happen with service learning, especially when you're working with a community that has a need, maybe an underserved population or a low socioeconomic area with students in a low socioeconomic area, what can often happen is our students that go out into that community can feel like they're the savior, right? You hear things that we're going to rescue those poor kids, or what it does ends up doing is reinforcing a stereotype instead of opening a student's eyes to the stereotypes that exist and the systemic issues that exist within that community that have put some of those people in that position. So with critical service learning, what's really important is to have those discussions before you start the project to help students understand and to see what the needs are, what the issues are, what the problem is in terms of privilege or again, systemic racism or LGBTQ issues or whatever social justice issue that might exist in that particular community. So incorporating critical service learning into the sport management curriculum then creates an opportunity to discuss issues around social justice, issues around poverty, issues around racism, issues around privilege, while maintaining the benefits of hands-on learning. All right, so why? Why critical service learning? I think we can all say that recent history has brought at least racism to the forefront, from Colin Kaepernick on the knee, right, again, to the Black Lives Matter issues that we've seen recently, to sports organizations stepping up and saying, we care about these issues and we're going to be involved in our community and be involved with those issues. So if there was ever a time to discuss social justice and sport management, I think now's the time. And I think that opens the door for critical service learning. So critical service learning is designed, again, to go beyond the discussion, to go beyond the case study, to put students in situations where they're interacting with people within a community that are experiencing that discrimination or that are experiencing that prejudice, or maybe that community is being completely ignored. So in my opinion, critical service learning, the idea here is to expose students to populations that are unfamiliar to them, that will raise their level of consciousness about the particular struggle that that population has have, that underserved area, and providing that opportunity then for social justice education to empower students to create positive change within their community. All right, so let's talk about then, how do you incorporate critical service learning into a course or into your curriculum? Let me say again, I'm not an expert when it comes to social justice issues, and I'm really not an expert when it comes to critical service learning. This is something that I've been recently introduced to. So I think it's important for you to start with, what are your needs in terms of where do you stand? What are your strengths and weaknesses? Like for me, I understood pretty quickly that I didn't know how to do this redistribution of power, right? That I didn't know how to really talk about racism in my classroom that would be in such a manner that students would be able to see the systemic issues that are involved around racism. So I figured out after trying it once that I really needed some help. And so I went to some of my colleagues in social work, sociology, education, even public health, when we were dealing with poverty issues. And I said, I don't know how to do this. Can you help me? What should I be saying to my students? How can I open the doors to having these conversations in my classroom and then follow it up with an experience with that community without reinforcing stereotypes? How do I get my students to see differently than how they've been seeing before? And so that was very helpful for us to identify where my weaknesses were, to try to go out and somebody and help me frame those discussions and how I was going to do reflections in my course. The second thing is if you don't have a community partner, or if you've never done service learning before, then get help from your Center for Service Learning or your Center for Community Engagement on your campus. Seek out that person. If you don't know communities that you could work with that are underserved, then talk to that person and say, what options do I have? And go in with the idea of, here's what I want to do, and allow that person then to direct you to finding a community partner, which is obviously step two. Before you go and find that partner, or once at least you've identified that partner, make sure that you know what it is that you want to accomplish. What do you want to get out of this specific experience? But also listen to what the community needs, and think about how you can blend those two together. Because remember that service learning is about meeting a community need. It's not about going in and helping these poor children, right? But it's what you can do for that community that will be a benefit of them, but also benefit you and your students in their learning. So once you find that partner, have those discussions. What are the goals? What is it that you want to accomplish? And then what can you actually do? And then once you do that, then the rest is easy, right? Then once you've decided on that project, then you just need to create your assignments. Remember for critical service learning, that you need to have those specific discussions before you start in on the assignments and before you start in on the project. And also building those reflections, whether that be at the beginning and the end, so you can see how your students have changed because of the project, or throughout the project, depending on how much time and effort they put into it. After implementing the project, then I also think it's important to what I'm calling reflect and revise. So reflect for you in terms of, did this project meet the goals that I had set for it? Were we able to talk about social justice issues? How did those discussions go? Did that meet what I wanted to meet for the students? And then revise accordingly. But it also means going back to the community partner and asking, did this meet your needs? Did the project go as you expected? what would you like to see us do differently? Because marrying those two together can create a better project for the future. And one last thing is, it may not go really well the first time around. It may not go like you want it to. Don't get discouraged. Hopefully what you can do is find a partner that you can work semester in and semester out with, at least over 2 or 3 times, doing the same sort of project so that you can, fix it and make it better each time. All right, so what did I do? So I'm going to just provide a short description of my project and how I try to incorporate critical service learning into this project. So we worked with a community organization called Bethel Park. Bethel Park is one of the Indy Parks and Recreation. It's part of that system. It's close to the university. It's only about 12 or 15 minutes away from the university, which is very, very nice. And happens to be that the manager of that park is a UIndy alum. He's a kinesiology alum. So it made that connection very, very easy. So him and I had a conversation. I have this facility and event management course. We'd really like to do an experiential learning project. What can we do? And from talking with him, we discovered that this is a very low socioeconomic area of town. A lot of the kids are single parent families. And during fall and spring break, they didn't have activities to do. They didn't have people to stay with, right? They were kind of left, a lot of the kids in that community were kind of left on their own. And Bethel Park did not have the staff to be able to offer a camp during fall and spring break. Well, that's perfect, right? You can do that in a sport facility event management course. One of the other things about the park is that they were only open from 1 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And so you had this large chunk of time where the kids didn't have anything to do or anywhere to go. So what we decided with the park manager was that we were going to start at 10 and go to 3. So from 10 to 3, we would have games, activities, we would have a camp at the park. And again, you can see by a few of these pictures, it was again in a low socioeconomic area that's very diverse, more diverse than the University of Indianapolis. So this gave this project an opportunity to invoke critical service learning and to talk about social justice issues. And particularly for us in this project, we talked about privilege and as it relates more to poverty than to systemic racism. And so we offered this camp, also knowing that these kids, and my students did some research ahead of time, knowing that the kids that would be coming to camp are generally on free lunch. 90% of the kids in that area, in the school systems in that area, on free lunch. So this will be an opportunity to make sure they got fed and to give them something positive to do while they were off for breaks. So what this slide's showing you here is the assignment, the critical service learning assignment that we did in relation to this project. All right, so I found a podcast called Revisionist History that was about a young man living in poverty and the impacts of poverty on his life and his education, those types of things. And so, as you can see, it's not very long. And so the assignment was, before we started the project, after we did some research, and we did do some research on the community, the students understood, like I said, where they stood in terms of poverty. We looked at demographics and psychographics of the area, those kind of things. And then the students were to answer the questions that you see here. After they listened to the podcast, just to give me in general their thoughts, this was a written assignment. Then I gave them the definition of privilege, asked them to list their privileges and their constraints. They turned all of this in, the privileges that you expect the Bethel Park kids to have and the constraints. They turned all of this in as a written assignment. And then we spent some time in class going through some of these things. So what is privilege? The definition of privilege, do they agree or disagree? We talked about the privileges that they have, whether that be from being in college, being able to go to college, having meals to we have a lot of athletes, so the privilege of being an athlete and having athletic ability and having the opportunity to participate. So just those types of discussions about privileges and constraints. And then after the project was over, then the students would go back, and those 4 questions that you see at the bottom were then questions that they answered again. And this would give me the opportunity then to look and to see, has this project made any difference in terms of them understanding privilege, which again then I think it helps them make the next step towards white privilege and systemic racism. But again, as I said, I'm not an expert in the area of social justice, so this was my starting point. So we did these We implemented the camp, and then afterwards they were to answer those 4 questions again. Now, full disclosure, I don't have any results for you, and here's why. So the first time we did this camp with Bethel Park, I tried to have this discussion about race and systemic racism. And as I said before, I didn't know what I was doing and it didn't go well. And I found out the views of my students were not what I thought they were, what I thought they should be perhaps, but even just not being able to look at it from a large picture. So after I got this help from those in public health and in sociology, then I decided to go with this model. So we started to do the camp then last spring, and we all know what happened last spring. COVID hit. So we did the first part of the assignment but never got to do the second part of the assignment. So then this fall, we were going to do it again. And again, same thing that happened in that we didn't get to have the camp. So I'm looking forward to doing this in the future to actually get to do the before and the after piece of this. The other thing that we did as a part of the critical service learning piece, the service learning piece of this project, was we did other research with this particular project. What I mean by that is before the camp happened, the students had to go and spend at least 1 hour talking with the park manager, right? Doing some research, not only about what the park looked like and what facilities were available, what programs they already offer, what do they think the kids like, tell me about the students in the area, right? And just getting familiar with that. They also had to go and spend 3 hours at the park observing and talking with the constituents. So I wanted, again, to get them familiar with the campers, we'll call them, with the youth there. I wanted them to get familiar with the youth and to understand their background and what the kids like to do. And again, so we use this as research in creating our programming, but also I use this as a background for them to be able to answer these questions about the privileges that they expect the Bethel Park kids to have and the constraints that they expect the Bethel Park's kids to have. One last piece of information about this park was only for junior high and below kids because the park manager felt like that was the greatest need. That was the age group of greatest need for this particular project. So some suggestions for you if you want to try to dive into this. And that's the thing I suggest, is that you dive in. I'm not afraid to try new things. Again, it didn't really go like I wanted it to the first couple of times, but we're going to continue to try. So I just created this list of suggestions that I think that might help you. And I'm not going to read all of them to you because you can have this here. And I'm sure that we can be able to supply the PowerPoint to you at some point. But I think number one, in terms of helping students recognize the problem that's being addressed, what the community needs, and the issues surrounding that are important. Have the students ask, why am I here? Why am I needed? Have students learn about the community before entering it. And I just told you how ways we did that. We looked at the demographics, the psychographics, and then I had them do that research by going to visit the park and speaking with people at the park. Near the bottom, it says ensure that stakeholders have an equal voice. I think that's extremely important, especially in service learning, but even more so with critical service learning. And that make sure that you have these conversations with the park manager or people that you're going to work with. What do they want to get out of it? And then allow them to have some feedback after it's over. Allow them to maybe even come and speak to the class. And we did that the first time around. We had them come back and share with the class what went well, what didn't go well, and what changes that they would make. The last one, let community members facilitate the class. What I mean by that is if you are feeling uncomfortable how to have conversations, and you feel that the community partner is good about having those conversations around systemic racism or social justice, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, then maybe the community member can come and facilitate that class for you. The downside of that is that the students may not be as willing to share, depending upon who the community partner is and how they handle that class. So you could consider that based upon whatever your needs are and what you find might work in your particular classroom. Right, so the last thing I'm going to share with you is just some resources. As I said before, I came into this not really knowing much about critical service learning. I had the opportunity to get to know some other faculty members around the state of Indiana through Indiana Campus Compact who had done some critical service learning, and they were very, very helpful as I planned this particular project. But I also went out and did some research on my own and found these resources. One of the ones that you see, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. This is a popular resource in talking about issues around privilege It's a really good one. And I like this particular website because it has the notes for facilitators. You can see a stereotype list if that's something that you're dealing with a particular community that you'd be working with. It has pre and post test service learning questions that you potentially could use. So these are all good resources. A couple of books that I'll recommend here if you're thinking about how do I measure students' attitudes before the project and student attitudes after the project. Bringle has a good book of different scales, different measurement scales that you can use. Some of them are global citizen related. Some of them are cultural competence related. Some of them are social justice related. So it's a good one to look through, especially if there's a copy in your library, or maybe you can go online and see the table of contents there and see what they are. And then if you're dealing with issues around poverty, then I would recommend this book, Framework for Understanding. And this was written for teachers, for those in the educational field. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope this has intrigued you about critical service learning and how you can really go beyond the case study and the classroom discussion to putting students in situations where they're working with people, underserved populations, or those that are experiencing some systemic racism or other social justice issues, so that students can really apply that and perhaps take that with them as they move forward in their sport management career. If you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. More importantly, if you have other questions, please feel free to come and join me in the Q&A on February 14th at 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Chris, and thanks everybody for dropping in and to see what's going on. And so really what's going on is, I hope that you had a chance to view the session about critical service learning. And I really just want to know what you want to talk about. And especially if you guys have some great ideas for me, I would love to hear them. So does anybody have a question or anything they just want to talk about? Jump in.
Thanks, Jennifer. I really, really liked your session. First question, why were you talking so quietly?
Was I talking quietly? That's not like me. Boy, if any of my students heard that, or my family especially, would be like, oh, she's never talking quietly.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, you know, it's an interesting concept that I've been like for years trying to wrap my head around how to get started. And I know that you had mentioned that you reached out to some people in Indiana, and those references, thank you for those, because I'm definitely going to look into those. But do you have any other advice on like how to get going? Because this is something like at our university at Tampa, we have a peace center that does a lot of service learning as a university. And then as most programs, sport management programs are, you know, we have our in the industry, we have interns, volunteers happening everywhere. So how can I incorporate, or how can anyone incorporate something like this in a class and get students motivated if it's not right specific sport, this is going to help me get a job?
Ooh, that's a great question. And that is a tough one, because you do need to try to make the connection for them, right? And how do you make that connection for them? And I think that starts with the conversation with, once you find a community partner, if you can find a community partner where you can say to them, hey, we are sport management students, but I'm also trying to help my students understand a certain social justice issue, or I know that this is an issue within your community, but we need to do something sport oriented. Is there a way that we can work together? And so this semester, I'm working with the Burmese American Community Institute.
Cool.
Right. And so that's like, yeah, but it's not, but what I've learned about the Burmese in Indianapolis is they're not really sport people. And so we're having a hard time making that connection. I'm having a hard time making that connection with the students of, well, the first thing we have to do is, and what the idea is that we design some type of wellness or sport day or week or continuing lessons. Like, it's really up in the air right now because we haven't started with them. And so my challenge is going to be to try to get the students to do what I call the research, right? Is to talk to the Burmese students and find out and make a connection with them, not only to learn more about what it's like to be an immigrant and a refugee in our country, and I want them to have those questions too, but then how can we relate to what they enjoy to what might be beneficial for my students from the sport world, kind of. And so, yeah, that's the biggest challenge is, I think, trying to find that connection with the students and trying to weave your way around so that you make it something that they can learn. So the other piece, the other thing I've tried to do, and I just did this recently, and this is sort of along the topic that you're talking about, but I started my class with, let's look at 3 entry-level job announcements and take those entry-level jobs. And I have some that I've collected over the years. And so I have some for them where they can look it up on their own. And we look at the skills that are required in those jobs and we line them out into class. And then like communication, right? Written and oral. That's something everybody's always looking for. So that helps me then when I do my writing assignments and even the reflection part of the critical service learning. Hey, this is also a time to practice your writing and to learn how to tell a story about yourself and your experience, right? And maybe it's organizing. Okay, well, you organized this project that had to do with this. So that's also helped me when it seems like it's a little outside the lane of sport management to get the students to buy in.
Yeah, and yeah, I appreciate that because that's definitely helpful, especially formulating those skills. So kind of as a follow-up, sorry, I'm kind of
No.
I'm taking the stage here, but as a follow-up, what you might have mentioned it and I missed it, but what class, like what classes do these go in? Because like I said, it's like we're so focused on the sport aspect, but as we know, as the conference's theme this year, this needs to be in programs.
Yeah. So my particular class has been a facility and event management course. And so that's been a little bit easier for me in making that connection in terms of designing a program or designing an event. But we've also done some things with our governance and ethics class. So the ethics portion becomes a little bit easier. And then one of the things that we did when we worked with Bethel Park with our Indy Park system, we did the spring break camp. The students from our history and culture of sport class came in and did an activity for an hour that was related to a historical aspect of a sport. And so they talked about that. And then they were supposed to have the students design like a game or an activity that would be related to that sport and how it's different and how it relates to a new sport, something like that, something active for those students. So we've tried to get creative in those areas and ways to expose students to different populations and think about then hopefully try to make connections with social justice issues.
Wonderful.
Great
Thank
question.
You.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Hi, yes.
Hi.
This is Janet. How are you?
I'm doing well, Janet. How are you?
Good, thanks. I want to thank you for doing this presentation as well. Really wonderful. Got me thinking. Of course, this can be used in a sport and society class, I think, very much so, especially nowadays. But I am teaching a venue management class. So how do you incorporate this in venue and event management?
Yeah, so I had the opportunity, as I mentioned with Indy Parks, had the opportunity to go out to the facility manager at the park. And he happened to be an alum. So that was great and easy for me. It's also in an area, in a low socioeconomic area of town. And so I just went to him and said, I've got this class and I want to do something for you at your park. And if you've got something in mind, like, is there something in mind that we can do? Now, usually when I say that, they don't have something in mind. So I try to come with a few ideas. And so I know that spring breaks can be hard for kids. And sometimes I knew in that area of town, some kids were left alone because parents were working or they were left to take care of their siblings because their parents were working and they were off school. And so I brought up the idea of why don't we host a free spring break camp? And so that way we can teach about facility or venue management through the legal aspect side of it, through the event side of it. And I use it also through the programming side of it. When we talk about programmings and demographics and psychographics and how do you get the kids to come and how do we market this camp? And so it enables me to do a lot of different things with that. So I reached out to the Parks and Recreation Department because I knew that we could also incorporate some social justice.
Okay, I think you did mention that in your video. I'm sorry. When I think venue management, and this is on me, I'm thinking something with a building, but you're right. Parks and Rec, why not?
Yeah, and they have actually a gymnasium, kind of a community centered place at this.
Exactly, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be football, basketball, any of that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. That makes sense to me. Thank you.
No, thanks for your question and thanks for coming. Anybody else got something they want to share or ask?
I have
Go.
a question, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Is there a risk at all, or have you run into any student? Okay, do you want to ask yours, Lana, or are you? Okay. Well, if you have, I think you have predominantly, well, you have a kind of diverse student body, but is there any risk of going into a community that, let's say, is primarily poor or a community of color, and then having a message taught that this is, if you're poor and then you are probably Black, or, having some kind of perception then that, I'm going to help you because that's the dynamic of our society. So yes,
Yeah.
there is a dynamic in our society where people help each other, but, along some of the race and ethnic lines that we're trying to sort of understand the systemic problems, how do you address that? Or is that an issue? Because I'm, speaking assumptions a little bit about who's in your program.
No, you're absolutely right. And so I think that's the mistake I made before I really thought about critical service learning. And that we would go in and we would help, we're going to do something for these poor kids. And in my good intention, I was sending the message that we're going to go in and that we're better than them and that they need our help and those kind of things, and not talking about systemic racism and issues of privilege. And because, again, as I said in my presentation, I'm not an expert on social justice issues. And so I had to learn some things myself, and I had to figure out how to present it so it didn't come across that way. And so I found for us, talking about privilege was a good place to start, because I made that mistake before. And I tried to bring in a conversation about perceptions of people of color versus perceptions of white people. And I found something online and brought in, and this was right after the first kneeling. If you remember Colin Kaepernick, it was right after that.
Yeah.
Oh, the discussion in class was heated, and students have very different views, and I didn't know how to handle it. And it was not good, really. I mean, I was not proud of what happened. I just don't feel like I gave the message that I needed to give. And so that's when I heard more about this idea of critical service learning and bringing those issues in beforehand and talking about them ahead of time. Did that make sense?
Yeah. Did you include the backpack as part of
The knapsack?
The knapsack. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's in part of the resources piece.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great resource. Peggy McIntosh, I believe.
Yeah. I've heard of
Yeah.
it before in other contexts. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in one of the resources I gave, and if I didn't, please somebody let me know and I can do that. There's almost a little teaching guide of how you can use that knapsack in your classroom and ways to include it in a lesson. Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah. Thanks, Heather. Anybody else want to chime in?
I actually had almost the exact same question as Heather. I know you mentioned it in your presentation, that these are tough conversations, and students will come in with some judgments or some stereotypes, and you kind of alluded to it. So the first time you taught it, you kind of fumbled your way through.
Yep.
So what are a few ideas or things that you've done, like concrete things that we can use so we don't fumble that first time?
Yeah. And again, for me, I think starting with the privilege talk has really helped to have students identify their own privileges.
And so is the invisible backpack handout, is that something you would use for that piece?
You could use it for that piece. I just have my students, we just talked about what is the definition of privilege, just in general. And then I had them, okay, we'll come up with 3 privileges that you currently have. And I tried to help them broaden their idea of privilege, because recently they've heard a lot about white privilege, maybe more so than they did when I did this a year ago even, right? And so I want them to broaden their definition of privilege. If you have athletes in their class, they're privileged because they have athletic ability that nobody else has, right? So even taking it to that point, for them not to just be able to see privilege as being a black-white issue, but as more of a holistic issue, I guess, especially since we're dealing with kids in a low socioeconomic area, that we've seen Black students, Asian students, like different ethnicities, and white students as well. And so again, I didn't want them to come in also with that idea that Heather was talking about. So one of the better times that worked for me was having this privilege discussion ahead of time and really identifying privilege from a large lens. And then thinking about, okay, well, what privileges don't people who live in a low socioeconomic area, what privileges don't they have? Like they can't walk to the grocery store, or if you have to take a bus to work, like what does that mean? And so that hits home in Indianapolis because our bus system is terrible, right? It can take 3 hours to get from one area of town to the other. S- And so, okay, what do you think are some of the privileges that those kids also have? What are some of the privileges maybe that they have in the Bethel Park or in the community that we're going into, maybe that we didn't think of too? So not only look at privilege from what they don't have, but also maybe what they do have and see if we could identify anything. And then coming back after we had our contact with them and asking those questions again to the students, what privileges do you have? Just to see if they named anything different or anything stuck out in their head. And what privileges do you see that the kids in that community have? And then, what don't they have or what are they missing in, so what, almost the kind of what can be done about it. And I've usually haven't even had to bring that question up. Usually the students then just start to talk about, oh, wow, well, well, that's not right. And what are the pathways? I'm also lucky enough to have an African-American man who runs that center. And so one time I had him come back. He just came back to the class and we just let the students talk with him at that time. And that was really good. Was that helpful? But the resources I try to provide to you are very practical. There's some really good stuff about poverty as well. And so I try to give you some really practical things. But if you still are like, I don't know, this is working for me and want other ideas, just send me an email.
Okay. I know I've tried a little bit, and part of the success depends on the students I have in class,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And their connection and comfort with me and with each other. And
Yeah.
then there's been some classes where it's just awkward silence and they just don't want to dig into these tough conversations. But I noticed the white privilege handout because I have it up over here. It has the color line in it. And
Yeah.
that's something when I worked full time in the real world,
Uh-huh.
we had to do as a leadership training, and it was with CEOs and directors. And by the end of it, people were crying because it was such for people who are professionals in the field, 40, 50, 60 years old, had no idea how privileged they were.
Wow.
So it was a very emotional exercise so I look at that and I think, yeah, I can do that. But I don't know if the emotions would be quite the same as what we experienced at the director training. So, but I love that. So thanks for sharing that.
No, I haven't tried the color line, and that's a really good idea. I haven't tried that yet, but I had that issue too the first time with students. Classes are different, right? I got a class right now, they're very talkative, but that time the students didn't want to say anything. So I ended up making them write things down, like, okay, write it down. And now talk to this person over here or something. Then I ended up making them talk to people they weren't normally used to talking to. And I put them in small groups of 3. Okay, you guys, what privileges do you guys have? And then across the room, because I had the same issue. They just didn't, it wasn't like they were engaged in anything that semester.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So when you're talking about privileges, I assume that you're going to talk about assumptions as well. Like, what are we assuming of people that, because we hear things. So if you're in a low socioeconomic background or whatever, you must be unhappy, or because you don't have, you're not happy. And do you talk about things like that, like assumptions sometimes we make as humans?
Absolutely, you can certainly do that. Yeah, not even just, I try to start with them, like what privileges do you have, and then we try not to make too many stereotypical, what's the word I'm looking for? Too many stereotypical considerations, right? But yeah, I mean, that certainly is something that can come out of the conversation if you have students that are also brave enough to stand up and say, these are the assumptions that have been made about me. And so sometimes you can go that way as well, and not just talking about privileges and constraints, but also talking about what assumptions have been made about you and how did you feel about that? As a female, as an athlete, when I was growing up, assumptions were made about me. And so, but the other thing I've done is also share, like, I'm privileged. These are the things. So I've shared a few things with my class because of this that I probably wouldn't have shared personally before, to try to also make them feel comfortable with sharing back with me. Yeah. Great point though. That's an excellent point, Janet. Yeah, go.
This is a good conversation. Have you thought about doing like a follow-up with the group of people that you went out and worked with? Like, is there any follow-up or debrief with them? Because Heather brought up that very interesting point that I don't think I ever thought of before.
Yeah, that's great. And we haven't done that. No, and that you're right. That needs to probably be the next on the list. Only with the park manager. We've never gone back out, never tried to have a follow-up with the students at the event themselves, but I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if, like, if I'm picturing me doing it, I'm not sure if I would be the person to do that. Like, the black male that you have as a partner would be a great person to do that, but
Yeah.
having an intentional conversation.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Jennifer, on behalf of Janet, Maggie, Lana, and I think we want to thank you for taking one for the team, because I think we've all been interested in this, but I've been scared. I'll admit that, like, I feel like I have these great ideas, but I'm like, oh, no. I don't feel qualified. And I think one thing you mentioned that really rang true with me is I need to do a better job reaching out to those university resources, because what I've found is that you may think you have a great idea, but they also can be very protective of the groups that they've been working with, and they have these long-standing relationships. And the last thing they want is, sport management thinking we're coming in doing some great service, but really our good intentions may actually not help them at all, and may actually, cause some other things to go on. So I'm really glad you mentioned that, because now I thought of one or two, but now I've thought of 3 or 4, the people who work with our DACA students. We have a lot of undocumented students where university is very ingrained in our Hispanic community here. And of course, we have a lot of close options that seem like they would be great fits. And I'm like, I have a lot more homework to do before I feel like I can go forward. So number one, thanks for taking one for the team. And number two, thanks for making me think through, like, okay, take a break, don't rush this, but maybe take one more semester to make sure I've communicated with all the people, especially those people who have been working hard for years on this. And I don't want to jump in like, oh, we can do something great without meeting with them first.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you were able to take that away. And yeah, I just admitted one of my terrible blunders. So yeah, sometimes I don't know whether I'm smart or stupid in jumping in sometimes, but I just jump in. So yeah, thanks, Colleen. I know you guys are going to do some great things there. You guys always do. You've got some good stuff going on at Metro. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Suggestions for me?
Thank you.
I would love to hear anybody. I'd love to hear what happens. Like if you decide to go forward with this and you have a great idea and something works really well for you, please feel free to shoot it off to me. I'd love to hear your successes as well. And maybe I can get something from you guys too. So thanks for your time. It's been wonderful to see everybody again, and good luck.